Hey guys, today I'll show you a horror TV series named 13 Klinicheskaya, Season 1. Spoilers ahead, watch out and take care. The drama begins with a surgeon named Dr. Kiril performing heart surgery on a patient when suddenly a spider appeared out of nowhere in the operating room. Startled, Kiril's hand shook, nearly cutting the patient's heart. Frustrated, he stomped down, scolding his assistant for not keeping the operating room clean. However, when he lifted his foot, there was nothing on the floor. Shocked and dazed, Kiril felt lightheaded and hurriedly interrupted the surgery to run to the restroom. Just after washing his face, he suddenly fainted. As a surgeon, Kiril knew he couldn't ignore it and immediately began a thorough examination of his own body. To his surprise, he discovered a massive tumor in his head, which his colleagues said was in a very dangerous stage, often accompanied by hallucinations of hearing and sight. No wonder he had seen the spider during the surgery. Kiril knew that with current medical techniques, there was no way to remove the tumor from his head. He could only wait for death in agony. Unexpectedly, a colleague revealed a secret. He said there was a hidden hospital nearby that might be able to cure Kiril's condition. At first, Kiril thought it was just a scam to take his money, and he'd rather spend his savings to enjoy the rest of his life. The sudden hallucinations made it difficult for him to concentrate on anything. Even sitting down to rest brought on a splitting headache. Driven by a desire to survive, he took out the hospital address his colleague had left him. Under the cover of night and through the pouring rain, Kiril headed to the mysterious hospital with the help of his colleague. It was strange that the security guard didn't ask any questions, but instead scanned them with a detector and took their cell phones. Curious, they soon arrived at a tall building. After his colleague registered at the front desk, he left Kiril in the waiting area and went to the office. As Kiril sat down, his headache worsened, and a short-haired girl nearby struck up a conversation. She was also there for treatment and had a similar tumor near her retina. Both in a similar situation, Kiril didn't offer any comfort and excused himself to go to the restroom. As he passed the reception desk, he couldn't help but vomit, causing several people to frown. In the next instant, a man rushed out, covering Kiril's mouth to prevent him from dirtying the floor again. Several cleaning staff quickly appeared, cleaning the area around Kiril as if he were a walking source of contamination. Thankfully, his colleague arrived just in time to defuse the awkward situation. Kiril felt indignant, thinking the hospital didn't treat its clients with respect. His colleague remained calm, explaining that this wasn't the worst of it, and led him to the hospital's examination room. Kiril wanted to refuse, having already undergone tests recently, but the examining doctor insisted on doing it again because this time, the scanning method was different. Seeing his colleague also trying to persuade him, Kiril reluctantly entered the examination room. Unexpectedly, the doctor took out a plastic bag and placed it on Kiril. Looking closely, Kiril saw that it contained several small bones. The doctor didn't explain, only reminding him not to move the bag during the scan. As the machine began to work, Kiril grew increasingly agitated. He had never seen a hospital that asked so many questions during a patient scan, seemingly trying to investigate every detail of a patient's privacy. Kiril couldn't take it anymore and yanked the bag of bones off his body. Just then, the lights in the examination room suddenly dimmed, and he heard faint whispers in his ears. It seemed like something wanted to break through the walls surrounding him. The doctors outside the room were alarmed and urged Kiril to quickly pick up the bag. Kiril hurriedly complied, and the room finally returned to normal. However, Kiril slipped into unconsciousness. The chief physician looked at Kiril in surprise and told the hospital director, Irina, that there was something special inside Kiril's body that could be helpful to them. When Kiril woke from his unconscious state, he still felt uneasy. The chief physician didn't explain but instead invited Kiril to join the hospital. Kiril shook his head with a bitter smile, knowing that his time was running short. The physician laughed and assured Kiril that his terminal illness was just a small problem and that he could cure it. Kiril was then escorted to a hospital room where he found a peculiar roommate lying on the bed. Before they could exchange greetings, several nurses entered the room to give Kiril an intravenous infusion. When everyone left, Kiril was astonished to see that the IV bag was filled with insects. His roommate quickly reassured him that the insects would disappear as long as he relaxed. Kiril wanted to ask more questions but suddenly fell asleep. When he woke up again, the IV bag had vanished, but Kiril felt his body was comfortable. After changing into his clothes, Kiril left the room and bumped into the short-haired girl with the tumor from before. Hearing that she was about to undergo surgery, he offered some comforting words and continued down the hospital corridor. Kiril found Irina, wanting to know what kind of medicine had been injected into him the day before that had alleviated his discomfort. Irina was odd, telling Kiril that if he thought it was the insects, then that's what it was. He then mentioned that Kiril would need to undergo a major surgery later. Seeing that Irina didn't want to talk more, Kiril left but grew increasingly curious about the hospital. He knew that the girl's tumor was incurable with current medical technology, yet the hospital was going to perform surgery on her. Driven by professional instinct, Kiril wanted to check on the girl's condition in the operating room, but was stopped by a security guard. He was now just a patient at the hospital, no longer a dedicated surgeon. Inside the operating room, several doctors were performing a craniotomy on the girl. Suddenly, bizarre events began to unfold. The rubber tubing in the doctor's hands started to bend, the IV fluid in the bag began swirling, and even the coffee in the hallway started to float mysteriously. The girl's eyes turned jet black, and the doctors around her collapsed one by one. People outside the hallway couldn't escape the strange phenomenon either, leaving Kiril standing alone. He felt a heaviness in his head, as if he was being called by the girl. A large mass of black liquid seemed to want to engulf him. Just then, the chief physician entered the room and pulled a mass of black goo from the girl's brain. The lights in the operating room came back on, and the collapsed doctors regained consciousness. The girl smiled at the chief physician through the window, as if she had accomplished something significant. Kiril stood up upon hearing that the young girl's tumor had been successfully removed. He rushed to the chief physician's office, believing that this was a miracle that could not have happened in medical history. He also wondered about the large number of people who had suddenly fainted. The chief physician did not explain, saying that there were many things in the world that Kiril didn't understand. He assured Kiril that as long as he worked there for a while, everything would become clear. The next day, Kiril received an employment contract from the hospital. After signing his name in the designated section, he officially became a surgeon at the hospital. Little did he know that his first task would be to hand over all his personal belongings. The HR staff threw them right into a burning furnace. After joining, Kiril was assigned to work under Irina, primarily responsible for treating difficult and complicated cases. However, the first thing that had to be done was to remove the tumor in Kiril's brain. Noticing that Irina had not scheduled surgery, Kiril became curious. Irina indicated that Kiril would find out soon enough. Suddenly, two burly men appeared and grabbed Kiril's arms. Then, a needle penetrated deep into his spine. As the fine thread inside was pulled out, a transparent fluid gushed out. Kiril looked at the squirming object in the bottle, not understanding what it was. Irina explained that it was his glioblastoma, which could alleviate his condition, but might not necessarily cure it. Between the lines, it seemed as if removing a brain tumor was considered a trivial matter. Irina didn't explain further, instead urging Kiril to prepare to receive his first patient. This woman suffered from sleep paralysis. Once she fell asleep, she couldn't wake up on her own. Even when she regained consciousness, her body couldn't move. Her husband thought the problem was severe, so he forcefully brought his wife to the hospital. After learning about the situation, Kiril felt at a loss. He was just an ordinary surgeon, and he had never heard of such a complicated case. How could he even begin to treat her? Irina reassured Kiril, telling him that their hospital had a vast array of medical treatment plans for challenging cases. She then instructed Kiril to visit a particular location. After passing through a series of security checks and numerous doors, Kiril arrived at a hidden archive room. Here, tens of thousands of exquisite boxes were displayed, containing records of unheard-of information. As Kiril flipped through them casually, he found descriptions of succubi and other demonic creatures, which were not uncommon. Kiril was astonished, realizing that this was no science-based modern hospital. On his first day as a surgeon, Kiril received a strange patient. When the patient woke up, even if she was conscious, her body couldn't move on its own. According to the hospital's standard procedure, the first step was to perform a full-body scan on the patient. A bag containing a bone reappeared, and with his partner Anya's explanation, Kiril finally understood that it was a unique protective amulet. Because the patient was in a magnetic resonance environment, the demon inside her might awaken. Without the amulet to suppress it, the demon could likely cause trouble. As for the continuous questioning, Anya said it was to determine whether the patient's thoughts had been controlled by the demon. This was actually one of the methods to identify the demon type. When the patient's scan was completed, Irina diagnosed her as being possessed by an ND2 type succubus. Kiril was quite surprised by the scanner not being used to detect tumors but demons inside. Irina scoffed at this, saying that the hospital has a unique medical system, and Kiril, who received a conventional medical education, naturally couldn't accept it. He decided to use conventional medical means to try to treat the patient. Using a sedative to put the patient to sleep, Kiril wanted to monitor changes in her brain waves. Perhaps he could find the reason for her immobility. Not long after, something strange happened. The sleeping patient began to squirm involuntarily, and her brain waves showed that her brain was in a state of extreme excitement. Anya couldn't bear to watch and unplugged the power of the equipment. The patient gradually returned to normal. Although she was awake, her body was still unable to move. It was clear that this was a side effect of extreme excitement during sleep. Kiril thought he had found the key to treatment, but Irina scolded him. Then she turned to the patient's room. In fact, she had already seen the patient's condition. It turned out that the patient had always complained that her husband couldn't satisfy her. However, in her dreams, she got chances to satisfy herself. After experiencing a long period of indulgence, the succubus inside the patient became powerful. Irina looked at the bruise on her neck and shook her head, indicating that the disease had reached its final stage. Originally, the succubus could be removed by removing the patient's gallbladder, but now it was too late. Next, the patient could only stay in the hospital and wait for death. Actually, Irina hid something from Kiril. The previous brainwave test had completely stimulated the succubus inside the patient. If it were removed casually, the gallbladder would cause a backlash, ultimately leading to her death. Irina expressed her dissatisfaction with Kiril to the chief physician. However, the latter firmly stated that he had high hopes for Kiril and decided to give him another chance to redeem himself. Kiril, who had been through a rough time, finally gave up on conventional medical treatments. He returned to the archives to look up related records, and with the help of Anya, he found a lot of information about seductive demons. The document stated that they belonged to the ND2 type, representing a moderate level of danger. Kiril was curious about how these levels were divided. Anya began to explain in detail. The hospital's founder had recorded many diseases with undetermined causes. Modern medicine attributed them to viruses, but the founder took a different approach. He attributed all these pathologies to demonic forces and classified them into three main groups. The first type was ND3. Although this demonic force could cause illness, its harm to the human body was minimal. ND2, on the other hand, could lead to severe diseases and even threaten patients' lives. As for the remaining ND1 type, the founder of the hospital had only one piece of advice: stay as far away from it as possible. On Kiril's first day, he was classified as ND1 type. Irina had suggested several times to get rid of him, but the chief physician refused. It was unclear what the physician's considerations were. Having gained some understanding, Kiril began reading about seductive demons again. This enchanting demon was created based on people's psychological needs, and its main ability was to increase hormones in the human body, making patients experience unparalleled pleasure in their dreams. The only way to remove it was to extract the gallstones it attached to in the gallbladder, and amethyst crystals could restrain its actions. Anya also learned from Irina that the seductive demon inside the patient had been activated by an electroencephalogram. Now it was no longer possible to treat it by removing the gallbladder. Kiril was upset, not expecting that his first patient would lose her life due to his careless actions. He wanted to drink some water to calm down, but found that the water cooler was empty. After searching for a while, he only found half a bucket of purified water. As he reached out to fill his cup, the purified water seemed to work against him. Angrily, Kiril slapped the water bucket, only to see the liquid suddenly burst out, inching closer to him like it was alive. The man was terrified and at a loss for what to do. Fortunately, Anya entered the room just in time. She immediately played cheerful music and took out an empty bottle. The liquid, as if summoned, turned into black smoke and entered the bottle. Anya explained that it was an ND3-type demon extracted from the human body, which did not cause significant harm to humans. It might have been secretly cultivated by a colleague at the hospital. As long as they stayed in fixed containers, they would not cause trouble. After listening, Kiril came up with a way to treat the female patient. At this point, the patient was once again tormented by the seductive demon, completely immersed in the wonderful pleasure. She knew that her life was at risk, yet she couldn't resist the temptation. This time, however, Kiril didn't act recklessly. He sought the advice of the chief physician and proposed a treatment plan. Since they couldn't forcibly remove the demon from the patient's body, they could try imprisoning it in an amethyst crystal as a compromise. After some thought, the chief physician agreed. Suddenly, they all received emergency notifications that the patient had gone into shock. The doctors managed to revive her, but there was no time to waste. They had to perform the surgery immediately. This was Kiril's first surgery since joining the hospital, and he couldn't help but feel nervous. Anya comforted him and assured him that the other surgical assistants were very professional. Indeed, the brightly lit operating room was equipped with mirrors in every corner. Although curious, Kiril didn't ask about them and focused on the surgery. The moment he opened the patient's gallbladder, a hint of red appeared in the surrounding mirrors. The demon must have sensed something was wrong. Suddenly, the lights in the operating room dimmed, and a seductive woman appeared, crouching on top of the patient. Just as she was about to harm her host, she turned into a cloud of black smoke and vanished into thin air. It turned out that Anya had already removed the gallstone the demon was attached to and wrapped it in a thin layer of amethyst to seal its powers. The patient was finally cured. After learning the cause of her illness, she decided to be honest with her husband and hoped they could live a happy life together. However, the revelation proved to be a devastating blow to the man. He dropped the bouquet he was holding and left, visibly dejected. On the other hand, Kiril, who had successfully completed his medical task, didn't receive praise from Irina. Instead, she was slightly annoyed and assigned him another medical task. This time, Kiril didn't dare to use his old methods and strictly followed the hospital's procedures, starting with an MRI for the patient. However, during the questioning phase, the patient's words seemed to convey a strong dislike for the fetus inside her. Even more bizarre, she tore off the plastic protective amulet on her own. An experienced Dr. Baldy, who was nearby, immediately identified this as an ND2-type demon. Kiril was shocked and asked how Dr. Baldy could be so sure. Anya explained to Kiril that if he could familiarize himself with all the records in the archives, he would also be able to recognize the type of demon residing in the human body. Villar, an ND2-level demon, was a powerful entity that could only attach itself to unborn children, causing great pain to both the mother and child. The method to expel Villar was complicated, involving severing the connection forcibly after childbirth, which would have devastating consequences for the baby. The hospital's senior staff discussed the issue at length, but couldn't come up with a suitable treatment plan. At this point, the chief physician suggested that they try negotiation. Kiril didn't understand the meaning behind his words and decided to talk to the patient first. To his surprise, the patient's behavior was very strange, with her pupils separating on their own. Kiril finally realized that the patient had been under the control of the demon Villar all along. No wonder she had been uttering malicious words during the MRI, which was not the attitude a mother-to-be should have. As they were about to part ways, the patient suddenly advised Kiril to leave, as the hospital was not the right place for him. After she changed into her hospital gown, the chief physician began preparing for the so-called negotiation. Kiril was a bit curious, wondering what they had to discuss. Dr. Baldy had the patient securely strapped to a chair, while everyone held a strange fruit in their mouths. As soon as their hands touched the patient, they were immediately pushed back by a powerful force. It was only then that the chief physician began negotiating with the demon Villar. When he learned that the demon wanted to take the lives of both the mother and the child, he pointed at Kiril, saying he would never allow that to happen. Villar seemed to sense something unusual about Kiril and changed its attitude, saying it would only take one life, the child or the mother, and it was up to them to decide. Afterwards, the operating room returned to normal, and Kiril looked around, puzzled about what made him special enough to make a powerful demon back down. Maybe that was why the chief physician insisted on keeping him around. This patient was extremely difficult, as a terrifying demon was growing inside her body. Now she had to choose between her own life and her child's. The pregnant woman felt immense guilt. Because the child's father was so despicable, she had once considered giving up on the child. The demon might have come after her because of that thought. Kiril said it wasn't her fault. However, she didn't listen to him and decided to sacrifice herself to save her child. During her pregnancy, she had come to appreciate the vitality and greatness of a new life. Kiril felt a mixture of emotions as he sensed the movement in his hand. In the following surgery, Kiril decided to save both the child and the mother. Despite the mother's consciousness being controlled by the demon once again, ridiculing the ignorance and foolishness of the people around her, Kiril quickly injected her with an anesthetic. His first priority was to remove the baby, and then find a way to sever the connection between the demon and the child. However, the demon was so powerful that it awoke on its own and began urging Kiril to make a choice. Irina, who was assisting in the surgery, sensed that something was wrong and pulled Kiril into the operating room, urging him not to act recklessly. If they didn't abide by the demon's agreement, the consequences would be unimaginable. Sure enough, an assistant came to report that the patient's pulse had stopped. The two of them rushed into the operating room without arguing, first removing the baby and then resuscitating the mother. As soon as she woke up, she grabbed Kiril's arm. Suddenly, the lights dimmed and his consciousness entered the alternate space where the demon resided. The demon was furious, scolding Kiril for breaking the agreement. It threatened to take both the mother and child as punishment. Kiril calmly approached the demon, asking what it would take to spare them. Unexpectedly, the demon changed its attitude, saying that as long as Kiril went with it, it wouldn't harm the mother and child. Kiril wondered what made him so special, but the demon just shook its head without answering. Instead, it mentioned the chief physician's strange behavior during the first negotiation. It seemed like the chief physician introduced Kiril to the demon with the intention of trading Kiril's life for the lives of the patient and her child. Whether this trade was worth it, Kiril already had his answer. Just as he raised his arm to seal the deal, back in the real-world operating room, the unconscious Kiril still lay on the floor. Irina seemed to sense that he was in trouble and quickly instructed Dr. Baldi to prepare a talisman. She herself sat on the floor muttering incantations. After much effort, a special metal piece was finally crafted. Irina solemnly placed it in Kiril's palm. Meanwhile, in the alternate space, Kiril had just clasped the demon's hand, and the demon disappeared in an instant. Kiril looked puzzled at the metal piece that appeared out of thin air. The next second, Kiril woke up in the real world. Irina looked as if she had aged decades and silently left the operating room. At this moment, the patient opened her eyes, looking blissfully at the child in her arms. The lives of the mother and child were finally saved. However, Kiril was filled with doubt. He sought out the enigmatic chief physician and asked why the demon wanted to take him away. The chief physician was about to answer when he sensed something special about Kiril. Kiril suddenly realized that maybe it was because of his metal amulet. Unexpectedly, the chief physician was extremely wary of the amulet and didn't dare touch it. He threw it into the incinerator, making Kiril even more curious. Kiril hurried to find Irina, asking about the origin of the metal amulet. Irina still looked quite weak. She said that the metal amulet could restrain high-level demons and was brought back from the alternate space by the hospital founder. Kiril finally understood why the demon inside the pregnant woman vanished upon contact with the amulet. But why was the chief physician also extremely wary of it? Indeed, no one in this hospital was a simple existence. After performing a teleportation spell, Irina seemed to return to normal, but her coughing revealed her weak state. Kiril wanted to inquire, but he was rebuffed by her. He reluctantly returned to the patient's room, only to find his roommate secretly playing with a phone. Kiril had a thought and wanted to borrow it to call his family. However, a nurse suddenly walked in, and the roommate's hidden phone was quickly reported to Irina. Unexpectedly, he had secretly taken many photos, which was a serious violation of hospital rules. Irina was furious and ordered the roommate to pack up and leave. Although he only had an ND3-type disease, he would suffer from pain for the rest of his life. Kiril tried to speak up for his roommate, but his pleas were dismissed by Irina. When everyone left, the young roommate returned to Irina's office. He looked determined and asked Irina to revoke his punishment. Irina suddenly changed her serious demeanor, revealing a charming smile. She slowly approached the young patient, and as soothing music played, their jackets came off. After the hormone therapy, the radiant Irina reappeared in front of everyone, her previous weakness gone. The young patient, however, walked out of the office with a staggering gait. Anya, who happened to pass by, saw this scene and understood. She rushed to Irina's office and loudly berated her for preying on her own patients. It turned out that many people here knew that Irina possessed a magical ability to gather others' life energy through hormone therapy to maintain a healthy and youthful body. The poor young patient was actually kept here by Irina on purpose. After a period of recovery, she would extract his life energy again. Of course, Irina's sources of nourishment were not limited to the young patient. In the face of Anya's accusations, Irina didn't show any anger. Unexpectedly, she was Anya's biological mother and even claimed that someday Anya would be just like her. However, Anya firmly believed that she would never follow in her mother's footsteps. However, the strange people in the hospital weren't limited to just Irina and the chief physician. Just after finishing her rounds, Anya discovered that one of her patients had passed away. She needed to quickly transport the body to the morgue because the people there all had different levels of demonic power inside them. As the two were about to reach the red zone, they stopped in their tracks. A figure emerged from the depths of the corridor, their face covered in vitiligo. The person signaled Anya to leave the body with them. Anya wanted to ask more questions, but accidentally stepped into the red zone, causing her to collapse. The nurse pulled her out, and she woke up after spitting some saliva. It was clear that only the woman with vitiligo could freely enter and exit the morgue. Although Kiril hadn't experienced all these strange incidents himself, he felt that he was in a bizarre environment filled with ghosts and goblins. Just after diagnosing a patient with ordinary herpes, Kiril curiously asked if the hospital also admitted regular cases. Anya, as usual, cleared his doubts. The hospital relied on special clients who would come to them, and salespeople who actively brought in customers, just like the colleague from Kiril's previous hospital. However, salespeople didn't have diagnostic capabilities, so it was normal for them to bring in some ordinary cases. At that moment, an announcement echoed through the corridor, telling everyone that Irina was about to conduct a dialysis experiment, and everyone should stay in designated areas. Kiril was about to ask what this was when the HR manager suddenly appeared and took both of them into a secluded room, even locking the door from the outside. Anya explained that the so-called dialysis experiment was transferring the demonic power from a patient's body into another person. Absolute silence was required during the process, so everyone was asked to stay away. Soon, the entire hospital was plunged into darkness. Kiril finally had the opportunity to talk to Anya alone. He couldn't help but ask about Irina and the chief physician's special abilities. Anya didn't hide anything, saying that the hospital's founder had developed a method to deal with the most potent ND1-type demonic powers, negotiation and fusion. The patient and the demon inside them would reach an agreement to avoid being troubled by the disease, even gaining special abilities at the cost of an equivalent price. Anya's mother, Irina, could maintain eternal health, but she had to absorb other people's life force. The exceptionally powerful chief physician and the woman in the morgue also likely had fused with demonic powers. Kiril thought about it. His body also carried ND1-type demonic powers, and he wondered if he had gradually fused with them during his previous treatment. Anya thought it was possible. His ability to freely enter and exit the demon's alternate space was an impressive skill. Kiril also learned that not every ND1-type patient has this ability. The tumor in Kiril's brain happened to press on the left parietal lobe area responsible for perceiving the real world. This might be the reason why Kiril could sense the alternate space. After listening, Kiril became interested in seeing how Irina conducted the dialysis experiment. Anya wanted to stop him, but Kiril wouldn't listen. She could only watch as he broke out of the room. At this moment, Irina had already brought in a corpse. The unfortunate patient looked around nervously. If the experiment succeeded, the patient's ND3-type demonic power would be transferred to the dead body. Although the patient hoped to recover, they were also worried about the potential dangers of the experiment. Irina confidently assured that as long as the demon's host remained stable, the experiment had a high chance of success. With the lights in the ward turned off, a bizarre experiment began. The dim room seemed eerie under the night vision illumination. Dr. Baldi planned to use a mosquito as a medium to transfer the patient's demonic power to the dead body. With the help of special equipment, the corpse began to tremble uncontrollably. However, the young patient let out a painful wail, showing that it wasn't so easy to strip the demonic power from a living person. Seeing this, Dr. Baldi had to forcibly terminate the experiment. Irina glanced at the lifeless old man and then scolded the young patient for being useless. As soon as she opened the door, she found Kiril eavesdropping at the entrance. Instead of reprimanding him, she took him to her office. Now, she put aside her usual flamboyance and sincerely proposed a deal. She hoped that Kiril would go to the alternate space to persuade the demon to revive the old man. If he completed the task successfully, he would become the second in command at the hospital. Kiril was puzzled and asked why she didn't seek the chief physician's help. Irina hesitated, then revealed that ever since the chief physician encountered a talisman specifically designed to suppress demonic power, the wound on his palm had been spreading. Irina knew that the chief physician had made a deal with a demon, but he had grown too old and could barely suppress the power within him. It was time for him to change bodies. For such an important task, Irina could not rely on the chief physician who could cause problems at any time. Still somewhat uncertain, Kiril asked who the old man was and why she valued him so much. Irina revealed that the old man was her biological father. He had been staying in a nursing home for years, until she recently received news of his sudden death. Unable to accept this reality, she stole her father's body out, which was prepared for cremation. The previous transfer experiment was actually an attempt to revive him using demonic power. After hearing that, Kiril finally agreed to venture into the alternate space and try to find the demonic power. Irina didn't hesitate and immediately started the preparations. She drew a few mysterious symbols on her father's body and took out a mosquito, which was used as a medium to guide Kiril to an otherworldly realm exclusive to the deceased. The moment he swallowed the mosquito, Kiril found himself in a strange space, surrounded by a thick fog. An old house stood in front of him. Curious, Kiril entered and saw an old man telling stories to a little girl. They were likely the young Irina and her father. Kiril tried to greet them, but he realized they couldn't see him. Even when he touched them, he was as inconsequential as a mosquito. The girl seemed annoyed by her father's intimate actions, but no matter how she resisted, he carelessly closed the bedroom door. Kiril wanted to stop them, but couldn't enter the room. Suddenly, the surroundings turned dark red, and Kiril found himself inexplicably at the hospital entrance. He curiously entered and discovered a mysterious demon imprisoned inside. The demon asked Kiril his purpose. Kiril wanted to help people, but didn't know how to start. The demon offered a deal. It could revive the old man if Kiril brought something to the chief physician. Kiril wondered why he needed to find the chief physician. To his surprise, the demon inside the chief physician was none other than Lucifer, the lord of the demonic realm. Meanwhile, in the real world, Irina and others were desperately trying to save the unconscious Kiril. Unfortunately, he lost all vital signs. Distraught, Anya stormed into Irina's office but couldn't change the fact that Kiril was dead. As the mortician prepared to handle the body, Kiril suddenly opened his mouth, proving he was alive. The mortician carefully examined Kiril, confirming he carried nothing, and let him go. After leaving the red zone, Kiril stopped and took a coin from his mouth. This was the item the demon had given him for the trade. When Anya saw Kiril alive, she couldn't believe her eyes. The joy of regaining what was lost helped her understand her heart. Miraculously, the old man in the hospital room also came back to life, part of the demon's agreement. Irina had long anticipated this, but there was no joy as she imagined. She hadn't forgotten the vile things her old father had done to her. After a torrent of harsh words, she picked up a pillow and personally ended his life. Perhaps this was the greatest hatred in the world, to make her abusive father die at her own hands. At this point, Kiril had already arrived at the chief physician's office. Instead of completing the agreement with the demon, he asked why he was invited to join the hospital. The physician said that order was needed everywhere, even in hell. Kiril thought of his imprisoned trading partner and asked if he intended to train Kiril into a useful demon. The physician didn't deny it. He had hoped Kiril would realize this on his own, but unfortunately he didn't. Kiril was outraged and threw the coin the demon had given him. To his surprise, the chief physician stumbled and collapsed as if struck by a powerful force. The HR manager, seemingly following directions, pushed the unconscious chief physician into the basement. Suddenly, red threads of light lit up, forming a giant cage. It took a while for the chief physician to regain consciousness, his face twisted and menacing, showing that his inner demonic power was out of control. Kiril was dumbfounded and hurried to the library to find answers. Anya once again served as his helpful assistant, telling him that the hospital founder had called those who made agreements with the demons inside them witches. Although the chief physician had made a pact with Lucifer, he couldn't resist the ravages of time. When he was old and weak, unable to control his demonic power, other demons would seize the opportunity to strike, allowing the demons inside to invade his consciousness. When any witch reached this point, the hospital could only imprison them, and their only options were death or finding a new body. Because the matter was so shocking, Irina didn't announce it publicly, only saying that the chief physician needed to recuperate due to a severe illness. She took over his duties and appointed Kiril as her deputy. Before everyone could react, she told them that the Ministry of Health would send a special envoy to be stationed at their hospital. Kiril didn't understand, as their hospital was supposed to be independently operated. Anya told him that this wasn't the case because the place was too special and needed to be under national jurisdiction and supervision. Unexpectedly, before the Ministry of Health's inspector arrived at the hospital, they received a new patient who was escorted by several police officers. It was clear that she wasn't an ordinary ND-type patient, but a witch who had made a deal with a demon. After researching, Kiril learned that the woman had a magical ability to freely manipulate organic matter within her body. She could easily raise a man's blood sugar and cause him to collapse immediately. However, these abilities came at a price. Unlike Irina, who needed to absorb young men's life force, the female patient had to consume her own vital energy to support the demon's power. In other words, if this situation continued, there would only be two possible outcomes for her in the near future. The first was to be like the chief physician, with her consciousness completely controlled by the demon. The second option was to break the agreement with the demon and transfer her power to someone else. Kiril realized that this was far more complicated than treating ordinary ND-type patients. Meanwhile, several sedans entered the hospital grounds. Irina greeted the newcomers with a smile as the investigators appointed by the Ministry of Health had arrived. These people maintained a rather cold demeanor, insisting on meeting the chief physician in person. Irina's smile faded, realizing there was no need to be overly submissive to such aloof guests. The group soon arrived at the high-voltage electromagnetic cage where the chief physician was being held. The investigators were shocked to see him imprisoned and immediately ordered his release. When the hospital's higher-ups didn't move, one investigator entered the cage himself. Unexpectedly, the chief physician raised his arm, seemingly lifting the investigator from mid-air. Thankfully, the HR manager quickly dragged the investigator out of danger. The investigator then realized that the chief physician was under demonic control. Panicking, he suggested they go elsewhere to take a look. The group soon arrived at the examination room, where Anya was examining the newly arrived witch. Curious about the hospital, the investigator approached to see what was special about this patient. Suddenly, the patient tilted her head, and the investigator's arm on the table went limp, causing him to hit his forehead and leave a mark. Frustrated but unable to find a reason to lash out, the investigator called everyone to a meeting in the conference room. Sensing the group's rejection, he decided to temporarily take command of the hospital. All patient intakes and surgeries had to be approved by him. Irina couldn't help but remind him that this would require extensive professional knowledge, which he might not be capable of handling. The investigator was furious and suspected that the chief physician had been framed by someone to seize power. He worried that this could lead to management chaos, creating social instability because the patients here were all too special. Just then, a paper shredder nearby suddenly sprang to life, sending shredded papers flying towards the investigator, teaching him a lesson. Irina explained that someone's spiritual pet had caused the incident, and it was usually harmless. The investigator, feeling resentful, believed that everyone in the hospital was against him. He summoned the owner of the spiritual pet, Dr. Baldi, and demanded that he get rid of it. To solidify his leadership, the investigator decided to recruit loyal followers. Kiril, who had been working at the hospital for less than a month, seemed like the perfect choice. All Kiril had to do was cooperate with the investigator's work, and the rewards would be substantial, including promotions and the exceptional privilege of using a cell phone. Kiril thought it was a good deal and volunteered to help the investigator learn more about the hospital's hidden secrets. The group quickly arrived at the morgue. After Kiril pressed the call button, the mortician with vitiligo slowly emerged. The investigator was excited, thinking that accessing the daily death records would help in investigating the hospital's situation. The mortician said they could come in if they wanted. However, as soon as the investigator stepped into the red zone, he fainted. He didn't expect to be defeated again. Filled with resentment, he noticed the witch who had just been admitted to the ward and recalled how she had also given him a hard time the day before. The investigator suddenly spoke up, saying that those who made deals with demons were not real patients or even humans, so why should the hospital waste resources on her? This put Kiril in a difficult position, so he sought Irina's advice. The investigator wanted to euthanize the witch, but she was also Kiril's responsibility as a patient. Irina was clearly unhappy with Kiril siding with the investigator. Meanwhile, Dr. Baldi was saying his final goodbyes to his spiritual pet. He couldn't defy the investigator's decision, and Kiril was even sent to supervise. Dr. Baldi was deeply resentful, angrily handing his spiritual pet to Kiril. Not long after, Kiril emerged from the incinerator room, his body exhausted. He was still contemplating how to handle the witch situation. Even Anya disapproved of his betrayal. As the witch was wheeled into the operating room, Kiril had prepared to euthanize her. The investigator, not completely trusting him, insisted on participating in the process. Anya remained silent, her face darkened. Kiril didn't refuse, only mentioning that the record stated if the witch's heart stopped, the demon she had a contract with would attach to someone else. To ensure everyone's safety, they had to take a special drug to avoid the possession. Anya then took out a strange snack, and the investigator imitated her, swallowing a bite. But he was quickly overwhelmed by the taste and left the room. After tossing away the food, Kiril quickly revealed his true intentions to the others. To completely cure the witch, they had to deal with the demon inside her. He wheeled the unconscious witch to the imprisoned chief physician, hoping to use Lucifer's power to suppress the demon within the patient. However, the chief physician refused to help, stating that he was no longer a doctor. Kiril, feeling dejected, was about to leave when Lucifer spoke again, telling Kiril that there's a powerful demon inside him as well, and he might seek its help. Kiril had a sudden realization and pushed the witch into his own ward. He had made up his mind. With the help of Anya and the others, they finally managed to successfully remove the tumor from the patient's brain. Although the tumor was the demon's hideout, it didn't mean the symptoms were gone. The witch suddenly began to tremble all over as the demon tried to forcefully take her away. This was the price of breaking the contract on their own. Kiril immediately called out, asking the demon inside him for help suppressing the witch's demon, agreeing to any conditions. Because of the deal, the witch's body calmed down, but she couldn't see anything anymore. Kiril explained that this was due to permanent damage to the optic nerves caused by the tumor, and also the price of using demonic power. However, it was better than losing her life. At this moment, the investigator burst in with his team, angrily accusing Kiril and the others of breaking the rules. Kiril, however, didn't care because the witch was completely cured. Watching the investigator leave, Anya worriedly asked what the demon inside Kiril would make him do as an exchange. Kiril shook his head nonchalantly, asking what could be more important than a life. Anya was moved by his compassion as a healer and couldn't help but get closer. As the two were about to search their bodies for mysteries, Kiril suddenly fainted. When he woke up, he guessed that this might be the price the demon demanded. He was about to ask if they should continue their body-searching game when he found that Anya's enthusiasm had vanished. She said she had inherited her mother's ability to drain the life force of others if she got too close. It was better if they remained ordinary friends. Kiril fell into deep frustration but remained devoted to Anya, promising to find a solution. Anya shook her head, saying it was impossible, or her mother wouldn't have disregarded the director's dignity and sought help from others. Kiril reluctantly set the matter aside for now. During a quiet moment, he sneaked into the incinerator room. It turned out that Dr. Baldy's spiritual pet hadn't perished, but was hidden away by Kiril. After filling an empty bottle with the pet again, Kiril found a patient about to be discharged and asked the patient to take the spiritual pet away together, hoping this would be the best place for it. In the following days, the hospital enjoyed a brief period of peace. Kiril would often seek out Anya, even expressing his love in front of patients. Although he was rejected by Anya every time, the poor investigator, after several setbacks, was no longer as arrogant as when he first arrived. In particular, after expressing admiration for Irina, the hapless man began a painful yet happy life. It was a peaceful day at the hospital until it was suddenly shattered. The janitor, who was cleaning the corridors, was shocked to find a pitch-black crack appearing on the floor. It turned out that the imprisoned Lucifer had escaped. The receptionist saw a rapidly growing crack on the wall. As she leaned in for a closer look, a jet of black liquid sprayed out. The hospital experienced multiple accidents in a short period of time, with many patients falling into a coma. All the doctors immediately entered the operating room to treat these unconscious patients. The black viscous substance on their bodies was secreted by demonic glands, possessing strong corrosive properties. It had to be cleaned using special methods, and even the surgical scalpel had to be wrapped with rune tape to protect the doctors. Meanwhile, the demon's former host was lying on a hospital bed, looking healthy and rosy. The investigator panicked, fearing a major disaster. Irina felt the need to explain. It turned out that at the very beginning of the hospital's founding, the demon lord Lucifer had reached an agreement with the authorities. It came to maintain the rules of hell in the human world, preventing demons from excessively harming humans. This hospital was, in fact, Lucifer's workplace. However, it had limitations when appearing in this space. It had to be attached to a human body to maintain a strong state, or other demons would come to cause trouble and replace Lucifer's position. Now, with the chief physician aging and weakened, Lucifer had to find a new host. The investigator asked if he was suitable, but Irina sighed, explaining that not everyone would be chosen by Lucifer. Becoming the demon's host would grant the host powerful abilities, but the host must also make a significant sacrifice to the demon. The investigator was still not giving up and asked who was more suitable. Irina said it needed careful consideration. At that moment, Kiril and Anya were treating a special patient. Whenever the patient saw food, the hands would uncontrollably feed the host. Anya diagnosed that the patient's body contained an ND2-type demon called Hippo, a demon that would uncontrollably seize food whenever it was in sight. In the later stages, it could control the host's every muscle. The treatment method was simple: completely block the location where Hippo resided. However, Kiril advised her to be cautious, as this demon had already awakened its self-awareness. While they were talking, the patient's hand moved to touch Anya's sexy body. Kiril quickly pushed it away and continued with Anya. Soon, the true appearance of Hippo appeared on the detection mirror. Just then, a crack suddenly appeared on the ceiling. Anya was frightened, her hands trembling, causing the detector to poke the patient, who retched continuously. Kiril quickly withdrew the tube and headed to a massive crack in the corridor. Curious to see the demon gland's secretion up close, he leaned in. The moment his nose got close, Kiril's mind was filled with whispers. He then walked towards the railing in the corridor as if possessed. The voices in his head urged him to jump. Just as he opened his arms, ready to face the fall, Dr. Baldi grabbed his air and pulled him back. Kiril subsequently fell into a coma. Following this, the hospital began disinfecting every corner. When he woke up again, he saw Anya silently crying on the bed next to him. Kiril guessed she was scared because of the Lucifer incident, but that wasn't the case. In fact, Anya had made a mistake during a recent surgery, causing the patient's demonic power to become active. Now, the patient's limbs were completely out of control, and soon his life would be in danger. The patient's body housed a demon that would uncontrollably seize food whenever it was in sight. A waiter tried to stop him but was knocked back by the man. Fortunately, Dr. Baldi appeared in time and knocked him down with a single punch. Kiril knew that surgery was needed to isolate the demonic power in the patient's body. If the delay continued, not only the limbs and neck would be affected, but the eyes might lose control too. Kiril pressed the patient's hand and forced him to sign the surgery consent form. After that, medical staff quickly wheeled him into the operating room. Kiril looked around, wondering where Anya was. However, as the surgery was about to start, he didn't dwell on it and focused on controlling the detection mirror instead. Unbeknownst to him, Anya was about to face a significant crisis. Her usually distant mother suddenly changed, showing a gentle smile. She urged Anya not to worry about the patient and to focus on dealing with Lucifer. Otherwise, the hospital would cease to exist, and Kiril would die too. Realizing the urgency, Anya followed her mother to the operating room. As the blood on their palms slowly dripped, mother and daughter entered an alternate space. This was the advantage of being blood relatives. They could team up for adventures. Irina said only the two of them could save the hospital. Anya was still puzzled about how they should deal with Lucifer. Irina said they could become Lucifer's host to obtain powerful abilities, but in exchange, they had to make a significant sacrifice to the demon lord, which meant one of their lives. Then, Irina handed a scalpel to Anya and pretended to sacrifice herself to make a pact. However, as they were mother and daughter, Anya's hand trembled as she held the scalpel. Meanwhile, in another operating room, Kiril was also struggling. The patient's hippo demon was almost fully awakened and resisted Kiril's attempts to seal it. Kiril didn't dare to use force, as it might result in the patient's death. As the stalemate continued, the patient's right hand suddenly moved. Kiril seemed to have an idea, and he quickly had the bandages removed. It turned out to be a signal from the hippo demon. It didn't want both sides to suffer, so it proposed a reasonable solution. Kiril, who knew some sign language, quickly understood. Not long after, the peculiar patient woke up again. His surgery had been completed, but the demon inside him hadn't been removed or sealed entirely. Instead, Kiril had reconnected a tube directly to the man's throat. This way, the demon could continue to eat and drink without causing the patient to feel hungry. This seemed to be a win-win outcome. Soon after, Kiril arrived at the chief physician's room, where he had already regained consciousness. Seeing Kiril, the physician spoke with a slightly weak voice, informing him that Lucifer would undoubtedly seek a new host. Only Irina could do it, but it required a sacrifice of her most precious thing. Kiril immediately thought of Anya, Irina's daughter. At that moment, Anya had already given up on the idea of hurting her mother. Irina held her, comforting her, but suddenly turned and slit Anya's throat. By the time Kiril arrived, the poor girl had stopped breathing. Irina's cold voice echoed from the corner, claiming that she was the one who suffered the most from her daughter's death. Kiril didn't want to say more, pulling out a scalpel to kill the mad woman. However, his hand holding the blade was out of control, slowly moving toward his neck. Fortunately, Irina had no intention of killing him, and with a wave of her hand, Kiril passed out. Not long after, Irina pushed the deceased Anya to the morgue. Only by cleansing her body of impurities could she become a suitable offering. Dr. Baldy cursed Irina before pushing Anya deeper inside. When Kiril woke up from his coma, 7 days had passed. He didn't understand why he was wearing a hospital gown, so he barged into the conference room. Unexpectedly, the chief physician had already returned to work, but Irina was sitting in the main seat. Furious, Kiril accused Irina of killing Anya, asking if everyone was indifferent to it. However, Irina kindly reminded Kiril to rest more, suggesting that the tumor in his brain caused hallucinations. He was then escorted out by the HR manager. The chief physician followed Kiril to his room, explaining that Irina's actions were justified, as it was to appease Lucifer and restore order to the hospital. As for Kiril's hatred towards her, the physician speculated that it was influenced by the demon inside him. Before leaving, he reminded Kiril that the demon inside might be more dangerous than Lucifer. Despite not wanting to accept the truth, Kiril knew he was just standing up for Anya. Memories of their time together surfaced as he looked at her belongings. Suddenly, a broadcast announced the arrival of a chimera patient. Everyone lowered their heads as the patient appeared differently to each person. When Kiril curiously looked up, he saw Anya, whom he had been longing for. He rushed into her room, only to be dragged out by the HR manager, who handed him a tablet. Kiril then realized that the person he saw as Anya was actually an old man. On a stormy night, Kiril couldn't help but miss Anya. He went to the Chimera's room even though he knew the person lying there wasn't her. He couldn't resist the urge to see for himself. Surprisingly, the Chimera sat up and said it wanted to discuss something on behalf of its superior. Curious, Kiril asked if its superior was Lucifer, but the Chimera informed him it was someone they had met before who had helped Kiril. He then remembered the demon who had given him the coin, possibly Lucifer's rival. As expected, the Chimera continued, saying its superior wanted to prevent Lucifer from finding a new host. Kiril wanted to save Anya, so they were actually on the same side. Intrigued, Kiril asked if Anya could really be revived. The Chimera nodded, explaining that the offering could only be accepted on the 9th day. If Kiril signed a pact with the demon superior before then, they could counter Lucifer and save Anya. Although Kiril didn't agree right away, he was already filled with hope. Now in the entire hospital, the only person Kiril truly trusted was Dr. Baldy. After recounting his previous experiences, Dr. Baldy agreed, believing there was a high chance of success. The only one who could take back Lucifer's offering was another powerful demon. Kiril made up his mind and asked how to sign the agreement. Dr. Baldy told him it could only be done by a dead individual, and he couldn't kill himself. Kiril was shocked, wondering if the chief physician and Irina had also signed contracts and why they were still alive. Dr. Baldy told him that they were not their original selves anymore. Kiril didn't say more and sought out the HR manager. After telling the HR manager his plan to revive Anya, the speechless woman showed her support through actions, personally releasing Kiril from the hospital. Since Kiril couldn't kill himself to sign the contract with the superior demon, he thought of a recently discharged patient and the spiritual pet who had been brought out of the hospital together. He then asked the Chimera patient to make sure his body was brought to the hospital after his death. Kiril got into the taxi with the Chimera patient, holding the demon's charm, and cursed several times. The next moment, Kiril relived an unforgettable past event when he mistakenly trusted a doctor, which cost his aged father's life. Kiril's body was now in the hospital morgue, where the mortician diligently cleaned his body of impurities. Suddenly, the lights dimmed, and Kiril entered the alternate space again. This time, a well-dressed man sat in front of him, claiming to be the superior demon's agent, here to help Kiril sign the contract. Kiril was curious about the identity of the superior demon. The agent said the demon had always been inside Kiril, but couldn't sign a contract privately due to Lucifer's constraints. Now that Lucifer was weak without a host, the demon could take advantage of the situation. Without further ado, Kiril pressed his bloody fingerprint on the contract. The scene shifted to the moment just before Anya's death. Although she was still stabbed in the neck, Kiril appeared at the critical moment, pushing Irina away and immediately performing a rescue operation. Dr. Baldy rushed in, not even glancing at the weakened Irina. The sudden interruption of the ritual had severely harmed her, and she soon collapsed, her face aging decades in an instant. Kiril was desperately trying to stitch up Anya's wound, but Lucifer's voice in his head was distracting. Fortunately, Dr. Baldy kept reminding him, and he managed to stop the bleeding. Next, they needed to restart Anya's heart, but Lucifer's resistance grew stronger. He was almost ready to appear and kill Kiril himself. Suddenly, a faint gasp could be heard, and Anya's heartbeat miraculously returned. In stark contrast, the aged Irina's body appeared in the morgue. The mortician lowered her head, her face full of indifference. At this moment, Kiril felt as if there was another presence within him, which uttered a name, Astaroth. It turned out that Astaroth, who had always competed with Lucifer and coveted his position, was a powerful demon on par with Lucifer in ancient mythology. Unknown to many, everyone in the hospital was actually working for demons. Some of them showed enough kindness, while others were more vicious than the demons themselves. Now, it seemed that the battle between the two powerful demons had just begun, and here concludes Season 1 of the drama. This is Daniel CC Movie Channel. Stay safe and enjoy your day.